Hey everyone, I'm Eric Gastfriend. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Americans for Responsible Innovation. We are hosting today's webinar, and looks like the participants count is steadily increasing. So I'm just going to maybe give that a minute to go up while people are joining and getting in the Zoom room. Thank you everyone for being with us today. Today's topic is going to be um, about AI model distillation and the threat of model weight theft. So I've got some great panelists with us today. And let's see how we're doing on our participant count. Still going up. It's great that there's so much interest. Just maybe we'll wait a few more seconds and we will get started momentarily. So I think we're about a minute past the hour. I think we can start now. To introduce myself and the organization, I'm the co-founder and executive director of Americans for Responsible Innovation, and we are a policy advocacy organization based here in Washington, D.C. Our mission is to help U.S. policymakers develop a thoughtful governance structure for AI that protects the public from harm and risks while continuing to foster innovation. And we put together this panel today on AI model piracy, the emerging threat of distillation and model weight theft. We have some great panelists with us today, Stephen Casper, Janet Egan, and Lennart Heim. And I'd like each of them to introduce themselves and their work briefly. Then I'm going to kind of batter them with a bunch of questions. And then around the half hour mark, we'll open maybe around 2:35 or so, we'll open it up to audience Q&A. And I'm just really excited and we'll finish up by 3 p.m. Promptly. So I'm really excited to learn from this esteemed panel of experts on the topic today of AI model distillation and model weight theft. So perhaps I'll just go in the order that I see. Stephen Casper, could you introduce yourself and your work in the next minute or so?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Eric, and thanks to the other organizers. Really glad to be here, glad to talk. So I'm Stephen Casper, but most people call me Cass. And normally you can find me at MIT. In the fall, I'll be starting my final year at MIT as a PhD student before I go into academia. But right now I'm on quick hiatus and I'm working at the UK AI Security Institute for 6 months. But everything I say today is just going to involve MIT things. It's not going to involve anything to do with my work at UK AC. The stuff that I do is mainly focused on technical governance topics. I'm an example of many people who historically work mostly on technical AI things and have slowly been gradually working on more things related more and more to governance in recent years. So that right now I think I'm at an interesting spot where about a third of the stuff that I do is purely technical, a third of the stuff that I do is technical governance, and about a third of the stuff I've been doing lately is purely governance work, which is pretty cool. Most of my previous work, though, involves themes or ideas related to evaluating AI companies and AI systems. So one of the reasons I'm interested in all of the topics of the day is because it relates to like how we, track and monitor AI systems and their proliferations and see how much compute is going into them. So I'm excited to be here for those reasons.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen. And next, Janet, could you introduce yourself and your work?
Thanks, Eric, and thanks to Americans for Responsible Innovation for hosting this webinar today. It's great to be here. I'm Janet Egan. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for New American Security, where I work in the Technology and National Security Program. Before moving to the US, I was a director in the Australian Prime Minister's Department, where I led work on national security, technology, and issues like 5G, critical infrastructure, and managing international relationships around technology. What I do now is I look at the national security implications of AI with a view to ensuring that the US and its allies lead in AI development and deployment, and that we can do that in a sensible way that protects long-term interests.
Great. Thanks so much, Janet. And Lennart.
Awesome. Well, also, thanks, Eric. Thanks so much for having us and talking about it. My name is Lennart Heim. I'm a researcher at RAND, and I do everything around compute, AI chips, and AI. I'm leading, like a team at the Technology and Science Policy Center at RAND within the Global Emerging Risk Divisions. And I particularly think about technical governance. Myself, my background is from computer engineering, so I come in with a fairly technical view on these kinds of things, but over the last few years, been merging this more and more with the policy side of things. My past research has mostly been concerning export controls, the worlds of AI chips. I've worked a lot with the organization Epoch, figuring out which kind of trends are going on AI. And then I look at these lines and these charts and ask the question, so what? What are the policy implications for this and what are potential policy moves we can do here? And I'm looking forward to the questions and our chat.
Thank you. So I'd like to kick it off by talking about or asking the question, just explain what is model distillation and how does it work? Is this new? And then how do we detect whether this has happened? And Stephen, maybe if you could kind of kick us off with the kind of distillation 101 story here.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. And spoiler alert, it's not very new, right? I'm used to doing a lot of research related to attacks and defenses involving bad behaviors of AI systems. And people have been excited about distillation in this context for over a decade. But distillation is a slightly different way of training AI systems to gain capabilities. So the normal way that we will train an AI system is by giving it examples of behaviors that we think are good, or by giving it labeled data, with labels that we like, or by giving it reward signal and having it learn through reinforcement learning in order to, accomplish some sort of task pertaining to that reward signal. With distillation, we just kind of try to cut out the middleman. We try to directly have the model imitate great behavior without having it learn from data or experience, like is typical in machine learning. So in distillation setups, there's always a system called the teacher system, and there's always a system called the student system. And once you've trained the teacher system, like some sort of neural network to accomplish some sort of task, distillation is just the task of having the student imitate the teacher. And there are different technical ways to go about these things, but that's the key there. It's like learning kind of directly from the outputs of some sort of teacher system. And distillation isn't kind of a get everything for free kind of thing, because you still have to train a teacher model, or one still has to already exist beforehand. But once you have that teacher, you are able to very efficiently train the student to very rapidly sometimes gain capabilities. And some recent demos with state-of-the-art language models and AI systems being trained with distillation very rapidly and cheaply to gain capabilities are kind of why we're here today. And the other bit of your question that I can answer is how do you tell if a system has been distilled? It's somewhat of a challenging problem, right? Because for one reason, it's not obvious. It's not like something you could just read off from the model weights. You have to use some indirect techniques. But another reason why this is kind of challenging is that AI systems today are the result of multiple types of training processes, and oftentimes a lot of data and a lot of experience and a lot of different kind of inputs involving pre-training and post-training. So it's this is known as a digital forensics problem of, if you want to ask a question, was this model distilled from this other model? Typically we'll have to just kind of throw things at it until we can make a case about it one way or another. One way this is sometimes done, though, is just by kind of, interacting with it. I think there was a recent demo of someone getting DeepSeek to think that it was ChatGPT, which is not a terrible piece of evidence that there might have been a little bit of distillation from ChatGPT text going on with the training of a DeepSeek model.
And to follow up on that, so my understanding is sometimes labs use distillation on their own models that they built internally to perhaps make the model smaller or more efficient. But there's also a concern that distillation could be used as a technique to essentially steal another company's IP, right? Without having to go through all that expensive training yourself, where you basically make that company's model, the teacher model. You ping it with billions of questions on all sorts of different topics, and you use all those answers to train your own model that can then imitate the more expensive model. Is that a fair description?
Cass, yeah, he raises his finger. Maybe I would actually throw out a question to Cass on this one and like say something we should differentiate here. We just talked about distillation. What we're doing right now here is ideally some type of distillation. We will be rambling here and people will be learning some things. This might be a somewhat effective way of distillation, not we will see at the end of the panel. But if you guys could wire into my brain, I think there would be like better ways of distillation here. So when we talk about distillation, we have to differentiate between, do you have like full access to model weights because you trained it, or are you trying to distill by just prompting the model and trying to get some synthetic data out of these kinds of things? And my understanding this, and Cass, please correct me, you're the technical experts here. Both methods do exist, right? For example, if I want to teach my model how to reason or how to talk to humans, I often use synthetic data from ChatGPT or elsewhere, like via the API, and then like fine tune these models in this direction to learn from there, right? Whereas if I have like the better way of actually going about it is I would have like full access to the model weights, right? So if we accuse DeepSeek of doing this from OpenAI, they've done this via the OpenAI by prompting this model to the same way you would interact with the model via ChatGPT. They did not do this by having access to the full model weights. If they would have access to the full model weights, they could have probably done it even more efficient, right? And this is like an advantage which OpenAI and other companies have over these. When they have like the model weights, you can wire into the brain to distill. That's different when you can only talk to the brain and you're trying to distill.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I would agree.
back in sort of Cass's comments earlier about the difficulty in actually working out what happens in distillation. So we've probably all seen screenshots happening over Twitter of like DeepSeek's chain of thought saying, hey, I'm ChatGPT, or I've been made by OpenAI. And there's been some analysis that show that there are similarities between some of the styles that DeepSeek uses and what ChatGPT uses. But again, there's just so many ways that these can come about. It can be overlapping data sets. Some people are saying that it actually could be DeepSeek just using ChatGPT to translate a large, high quality data set into English, for example, that would potentially explain stylistic similarities. And I think that what that's pointing to is that the science of verifying if distillations happened when it hasn't been the company doing it to its own model is really underdeveloped, and probably what Stephen's working on in his work a bit as well. But I think it's an area we do need further effort because, to put it in perspective, Eric, you mentioned the high costs and investments going into these leading AI models. Like the US Stargate project alone is investing $500 billion in new AI infrastructure. By 2030, we're expecting the leading model to be trained on the equivalent of 5 large-scale nuclear reactors of energy. And so if it is possible for China or other actors to bypass this training investment, experimentation, and simply copy an almost good copy of such a model, it would be a massive own goal. But I think what we're seeing here is that there's much more work that's needed to actually understand to what extent are these risks being realized at the moment, or what might those look like into the future.
Um, and I wanted to remind people to you can the audience, you can put questions into the Q&A, and I might take some of them as we go, but then we'll have time for going through those questions in the second half. And as a follow-up question here, I want to put you to the panelists on the spot and ask how likely do you think it is that the DeepSeek models were, or the latest DeepSeek model was uh, distilled from OpenAI? If you had to put like a number probability on it, because OpenAI has said that they believe that DeepSeek distilled their model. Certainly, I think a lot of people believe that. And perhaps that's even kind of like taken hold as the dominant narrative. I hear you guys kind of expressing some more kind of uncertainty around it. So I'm curious what each of you believe personally.
I'm happy
Maybe we can
to
go in the
first,
same
I
order.
think,
Oh,
pass
yeah,
Yeah,
on.
Jenna,
you
go
go.
ahead.
I think you'll out-trump my technical knowledge here. So I can say something basic and then you can add a lot more into it. I think that it would be foolish to expect that the incredibly talented team at DeepSeek didn't use every resource at their disposal to progress their work in this space. So I think there's definitely been some engagement with ChatGPT and some like querying, and this is what OpenAI is saying, is that they think there is a potential that there's been, querying of their model to get that synthetic data or those answers to model off. But I think it's reductive to say that that explains DeepSeek's breakthrough. And there's a lot more happening here in terms of we're seeing, in general, compute is being used more efficiently over time, and algorithmic breakthroughs are allowing that. And the researchers on this team are incredibly talented, and have access to a lot of that knowledge. So I think that's also has to be taken into account.
My answer, so I will resist trying to like put a probability on it because I can't do that while working at the UK AI Security Institute. But based on the limited knowledge that I have, accusations of, OpenAI's data being used seems neither completely airtight nor completely crazy. I think this is a pretty legitimate question to be asking. And it's a pretty important question, both from a legal and a technical perspective, because if OpenAI's data was used for distillation, this would be a violation of terms of service that OpenAI has. And if distillation from a system like OpenAI was a big factor in DeepSeek's capabilities, then this gives us a really important demonstration about just how much distillation can enable a rapid AI proliferation.
I'm gonna say a number because nobody else does it. I'm like at 85% that like some type of distillation played a role here. But I think it doesn't matter. Eventually, for the points which Janet just brought up, it's an incredibly talented PE team. They use the resource which are available to them. There will be more data from ChatGPT all over the internet in the future. This is just like the new future we should expect. I could imagine it becomes more important going forward if you want to basically extract the reasoning data. I think this is where it gets more interesting, trying to extract the reasoning chain. That's why DeepSeek is a big deal, because we can see the reasoning out loud, which is like interesting training data going forward in the future. And yep, it probably violated OpenAI's terms of service. I think there's a lot you can do. I will wish them good luck trying to sue them and then trying to prevent it.
So on the prevention question, um, let's I'm gonna kick this question over to Janet. And as you mentioned, Janet, the labs are spending billions and hundreds of billions of dollars in investment in building these models. What can they do to protect their IP, and prevent the theft of model weights? I think there's been a lot of talk about cybersecurity at the labs and making sure that dedicated state actors can't get in and steal the weights. But with distillation, you don't need like it's not really like a cyber operation of stealing the weights. It's just getting enough requests in to the model before they notice what's going on. Yeah, what can labs do? What are they doing about it?
Yeah, I won't purport to know the fine details of what's happening inside the labs as they seek to address this potential vulnerability. But I think there's a lot that can be done through more sophisticated, like know your customer for large scale customers and users, monitoring usage patterns like high volume, systematic querying of model, especially if it's logging thousands of inputs, seemingly designed to map a model's like decision boundaries and like breadth of expertise. So I think there's a lot you can do and automate in a system to ping if there's sort of unusual activity that seems inconsistent with what you might expect. But I think like that can be sort of one method of trying to manage unwanted but sort of legitimate access to a model that is then used for distillation. I think there's a bigger conversation at play where both AI data centers and AI labs are becoming increasingly attractive targets for foreign states and state-backed actors. And I think what we see in the telecommunication space, which is the crown jewels of critical infrastructure, is that the private sector maybe doesn't have the full incentives to manage all national security risks, but also doesn't have the capabilities to like withstand a sophisticated state-backed actor like Chinese cyber actors. And so the fact that we've had such a pervasive hack of US telecommunications for so long, I think is a warning sign that we're having new players enter a market. The AI market is becoming increasingly attractive for espionage, and in future it could be for sabotage as well. And so I think we really need to be thinking about how do we get the bodies like the NSA to partner more closely with the private sector to share insights about ways that these hacks can happen. And with that information, co-design rules and regulations and standards that can actually uplift the cybersecurity of data centers and labs. Um, it's a tricky balance. You don't want to make it like I've worked in a skiff for years, and you don't want to make it so obstructive that you can't get anything done. But you do want to have this in mind now because security by design is the only way to get real proper cybersecurity. And it's really hard to retrofit that onto labs and data centers once they've been built, constructed, and set up. So I think you want to start building that optionality in now to stop like exfiltration of model weights, and also to make sure that as these systems become more and more critical, they're not just open for sabotage or other nefarious actions.
One quick comment here is that I really like Janet's answer here. I'm glad you gave that answer and not me. But one question one could ask at this point is like, but so what? Why is model weight so important? We have a lot of very advanced models like from Meta and from DeepSeek, just being open sourced. And on one hand, this is sometimes going to be true. But I think one of the reasons why it's really, this is such a big problem that you're talking about, Janet, is because we might be on the frontier of systems that we might not just want to like be open sourcing, at least not indiscriminately, right? Labs like Anthropic and OpenAI have very recently, in their reports on new frontier models, openly speculated that significant risk thresholds for like bioweapon or cyber weapon misuse could be crossed within the year 2025 as they continue to develop more and more models. So I think this kind of helps to frame kind of the stakes with these issues here. At a certain point, it stops being just always okay to open source things, and we might need a lot more carefulness or a lot more safeguards or deliberation into how systems at the next level or the next level end up being deployed.
And Cass, is there research going on at the safety institutes that could be helpful for the labs in addressing these issues around model weight security? Is that something that the AI Safety Institutes, is it part of their mission, something that they look into and work on?
Yeah, I can say that cybersecurity is a big interest of the US and the UK AI Safety Institute. I won't say much more because I neither know nor would probably be able to say too many things about specific projects here. Um, but it's certainly, in national interests and in lab interests to like try to make systems as robust as possible to attacks even from like like cyber attacks even from state level actors for all the reasons Janet talked about. And in some ways, these things are going to be traditional cybersecurity problems, and tradition involving like physical and digital kind of threats that might be um, threat vectors that might be kind of introduced against labs. But in other ways, there are some unknown unknowns to like do our best to prepare for because um, as AI systems get superhuman at more and more tasks at a pretty steady pace, cyber offense might be one of those domains in which they get pretty good sooner than we might like them to.
And Janet, you brought up the NSA, I think. One of the policy ideas we've been kicking around here at ARI is could we have the NSA or other government agencies in the US actively participate with frontier labs to do like penetration testing, right? To see like, can the US intelligence community break into these systems in, like a friendly, cooperative way? And if so, can the labs mitigate those issues? And curious for anyone on the panel whether that idea might have merits in terms of kind of public-private partnership on working together, utilizing the best talents of inside the government and the important IP protections and security that the labs need to build out.
From my end, I think it's a great idea. I think traditionally, like cyber agencies tend to play this dual role of like protector and also exploiter overseas. So protect at home, exploit overseas. And I think to date, there's been like when you have really specific cyber exploits or really like high level capability tradecraft, you do want to keep that quite protected and really limited in who knows that because it can give you such good intelligence that can then protect your national security. But I think AI could actually pose a paradigm shift to that if, for example, autonomous cyber capabilities being developed internally in these data centers, in these labs, become exponentially better than what we already have from the cyber experts in the NSA. We might then see this pivot away from like focusing on protecting the offensive side to thinking about how can we release more of that information to the labs or actually bring some of that information into the labs to guard them against some of those vulnerabilities that other adversaries might look to exploit. So I think there's always these trade-offs to make and balance, and of course, complex regulations and legislation that dictates what NSA can do onshore and offshore. But I think getting that expertise and partnering with the labs and understanding that AI could potentially be much more critical than any other technologies or sectors we've tried to protect in the past, I think is the right way forward.
Lennart, I've got a question for you. I think the billion-dollar question around the DeepSeek story is, do export controls still matter? Obviously, DeepSeek has made a lot of algorithmic improvements, and I don't believe that it cost them just $6 million to build their model, but it seems like they got very far on a much smaller budget than at least most people in the industry thought possible based on the stock market reaction. And it's made a lot of people, including lawmakers here in DC, question whether the export controls are still going to be effective in a world where you have increasing gains in algorithmic efficiency, where maybe it won't require massive amounts of compute to train an excellent model. So can you give us your take on that?
Many takes on export controls and DeepSeek. I probably will also just share links to the op-eds because I cannot cover every single point here. I think the first observation is like roughly right, but people are just like questions like, wait, we thought we kind of stopped them. They will never be able to participate at Frontier again. I'd wish that be the case. I wish policy would be that easy. We do like one policy move 2 years ago and we cut somebody out of the race, right? We still call it a race because there is competition going on. To understand this, I think it's first of all important to understand the history of export controls. History of export controls started early in the Trump era with like entity listing of Huawei, ZTE, stopping the Dutch from selling these cutting edge machines to China for them to build the more advanced chips. But then only in 2022, we started controlling AI chips themselves, right? We had this whole package, basically stopping China from producing AI chips themselves, stopping them from producing them elsewhere over at TSMC in Taiwan. Spoiler, they did it anyways recently. And third, to not also buy cutting edge AI chips. Unfortunately, the first export control package had, in my opinion, I think as they later acknowledged, like some mistakes in numbers. So the export control was done. NVIDIA released a new chip right below the thresholds, the so-called NVIDIA 800, later NVIDIA H800. And these are the chips which DeepSeek used. I would love to live in a parallel world where we would have gotten the export controls right from the beginning. I would claim DeepSeek would not be where it is right now, but unfortunately, we didn't get it right from the beginning, so it took us a year to fix them. This means we have only working export controls since October 2023. It's a little bit more than 14, 15 months now we've been working export controls. Turns out, if you train a model, if you're like an AI company, you build your cluster many years before, right? You don't build it yesterday to train a model today, so you operate it over like a time scale. Usually, chips last like 4 to 5 years. So this basically means, long story short, we don't see the real impact of export controls yet. And then secondly, it's harder to see this impact on export controls on a single company. I think the best way to think about it is just like we limit the total amount of computational resources going to China, going to the PRC, and then being available to the actors. They have one company releasing a good model, maybe two, maybe three, depending how we count it. The Western world has way more companies releasing cutting edge models, which are the frontier, and then they also deploy them at scale. So it's one thing to build it, it's another thing to deploy it then at scale. So we've also seen with DeepSeek, once they deployed it, many people access it, they limited the usage at some point to only Chinese phone numbers, right? I would claim they probably had like some GPU crunch issues in the background where they simply didn't have enough compute. Then you were pointing to they're becoming more efficient. That's a general trend we've seen in machine learning over time. And I really want people to embrace this trend because it's simply the reality. Capabilities will diffuse, it's easier to replicate. Being a fast follower is easier than being a leader. This means we will see these capability breakthroughs at these companies who spent the most compute on it, who spent millions on it, but then later people will be able to replicate this for cheaper. That's the case. They were able to replicate something later. for cheaper within the trend lines. That's what we've seen. What are the trend lines here? Every year, roughly the cost half. Last year it cost me 10 million, this year 5 million, next year 2.5 million. That's an exponential decrease. This is kind of like what we're fighting here with. So to summarize, export controls help at the frontier. They limit the compute. They have like a vast impact on the ecosystem because you have way less compute. But at the same time, export controls don't completely solve the problem of diffusing AI capabilities. They solve the problem of exercising AI capabilities at scale because of how much compute you have. But being able to replicate stuff will always be easier. And that's just a reality we all have to grapple with. What I generally say that, yep, that's why we need resilience and adaptation to just then deal with these capabilities being replicated by others. Still, export controls help you to maintain a lead and potentially build up this lead over time. There will never be a clear cut where we just say, we've won, that's it, they're out of the game, unfortunately.
And I believe that the founder of DeepSeek said a few months ago to local Chinese media, maybe before they were so famous, at some point last year, that the US export controls were the biggest barrier and blocker to their progress. Is that something that we can take as kind of a sign that the export controls are working, and that if we had, Leonard, as you had said, kind of tightened up those export controls sooner, that the US would have an even stronger lead?
Absolutely. It's the CEO himself. It's their employees themselves who say compute is key. It might all be bait. I think it's quite unlikely. I think they just acknowledge it. Compute is the currency in San
It'd be
Francisco,
like
is the
if it was
currency of
bait, it's the
AI.
wrong thing to say, right? The bait should
Well,
be the opposite.
maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just a distraction we shouldn't update. I don't know. But again, let's just go for the simple move here. It's like, yeah, they just say what's true. These are real research scientists. These are like, at least initially, they were not part of geopolitical competition. I think they're now changing their mind the more the CCP gets interested in them over time. And I think the important thing to track here is maybe some people of you are tracking Elon Musk and its company XAI. They just, I think a week or 2 weeks ago, released their most recent model, Grok 3. Grok 3 was a model trained on a news cluster with 100,000 or 200,000 H100. That's a massive cluster. That's the biggest publicly known cluster we currently have out there. I'm not aware of any single cluster in China at that size. So what we're seeing, they replicate, but people still continue pushing the frontier. And people believe continued scaling of the pre-training compute, what we've seen over time, but also the continued scaling of this new paradigm, which we've seen, which is the reasoning, right? Everybody talks about OpenAI's ChatGPT's o1, o3, which reason out loud. And again, to reason out loud, these models need to produce tokens. They think. To think, you need compute. So the importance there just became bigger. And to think out loud, to be good at this, we do something before with these models. We do a reinforcement learning step. And when we look, for example, at DeepSeek, they spend at least 10% of their compute just on a reinforcement learning step. And what many people expect for the future to be, we continue scaling the pre-training as we've done the last decade. Maybe we'll cease hitting some limits there, but now we will continue scaling this reinforcement learning step where we make the model basically play and reason with itself and getting better over time. And for this, again, you need compute. So if these paradigms continue coexisting, export controls will just basically hit harder and harder over time. This is just the reality of things. The question is like, it's hard to say which way these AI systems will develop. And even if people continue pushing using more compute for this, at the same time, the next day, people will be able to replicate it for cheaper, right? The question is like where these trend lines are going. And historically, we've seen the trend line going for we spending more has been faster than the trend line. It costs us less. The one trend line of us spending more has been double as fast. This means the overall cost has been going down for AI capabilities, right? And I really just want people to remember again, we talked about like the 6 million marginal cost for training DeepSeek. Building such a cluster costs hundreds of millions in GPU costs. This is not something somebody does in the garage, right? Again, this does not solve all the problems, at least solve the problems with like lone wolves and others for now training these systems. So at least from a governance perspective, there's a limited number of actors we need to pay attention to.
And Leonard, sorry, I didn't quite understand. What did you mean by export controls get harder and harder in this world where inference and runtime compute matter more?
Oh, they bite harder and harder. Sorry
Oh,
for
they
not being
bite
clear,
harder.
right? Because like we continue scaling compute for building better models, for doing more reinforcement learning, and then we will also deploy more of them, right? And again, I just want people to remind of the premise these AI companies have. They talk about AI workers, they talk about AI agents, they talk about replacing jobs. These systems should be autonomous. And then again, how many AI workers you have is just, again, a function of how many GPUs you have. I totally get why people spend 500 billion on building more data centers if this is what you believe. You just simply need this compute. This is your currency. This is literally your population of AI workers.
So, Leonard, to rephrase, let me know if I'm getting this right. Um, if uh, if we're in a world where inference and runtime compute matters more and more, as it does with the reasoning models, say we lose the battle on protecting the model weights, and either like the model weights can be stolen or distilled, and our adversaries are able to get highly capable models. If we put in place the right export controls, we can still limit other countries' ability to deploy these models and adopt them throughout their economy, which is ultimately the thing that really matters for economic military competition. Is that fair?
That seems fair. I think I'm not sure if it ultimately matters for everything. I would say depending on what you care about. I think you're totally right about the economic impact. And we all know economic impact is important for the military impact. I think we should still be worried about other. Again, I made this example of AI workers. How much compute you have determines how many AI workers you have, therefore the economic impact. I think that's a pretty clear cut. How does this cut for cyber misuse, cyber capabilities? Are you 10 times better with having 100 AI agents which are trying to hack you? I think it's not really clear where you fall. And I think the worst example I can bring up is like designing bioweapons, right? You don't need 100 scientists to design these bioweapons. You basically just need like one AI run for long enough and give you the dangerous formula and then the actor to act on it. So again, depending on what we're worried about here, economic impact clearly dependent on how much compute you have. Other threat models, in particular, designing and building bioweapons, are less dependent on how much compute you have.
One
Cass, you want
small
to
comment
jump in?
I can
Yep.
make. Yeah, this is very, very short. And I'm glad Lennart's here to say all the hard and long stuff. But um, to the point that you've both been talking about, we shouldn't be surprised to kind of continue to see um, restrictions on physical compute and like where it goes overseas and who can use it. I wouldn't be very surprised either if we continue to see trends involving digital protectionism, where companies or governments take steps to restrict what countries their customer bases are in. Right. Just like we saw a saga recently play out with TikTok and then maybe not being able to be accessed in the US. I would not be surprised at all if we saw some similar things, but with AI companies and AI services as well. That's all.
Great. I'd like to jump to audience Q&A now. Audience members, please put your questions in the Q&A. You can do it anonymously or under your name as you prefer. And we'll just kind of jump around some of the questions that we're getting. Um, so the first question we'll take from Ashley is it possible for developers to jump to distilled models without the amount of resources required to build the base teacher model? I think the answer there is yes. It probably takes a fraction of the resources to distill a model that someone else has already built and trained. And I see panelists nodding. Right. Um,
I would go back to my previous point. It depends what exactly you mean with distillation. I hate to be the guy and say it's like more complicated here, right? Depending on which type of distillation you use. For if you distill from like a llama, which is an openly a public model weight, that's different than you distilling from the OpenAI API, right? And then again, I would just remind people this is against the terms of service, so I wouldn't recommend anybody to do it. But theoretically, you could do so, and then it's like a fraction of the cost. How exactly the fractions of the cost are, it's an evolving literature on these kinds of different things. And I also expect sometimes we see artifacts where the models are not as good. The more important thing is companies are really incentivized to do this themselves. They train the big model, but we just talked about this test time compute where they generate tokens for thinking. So they prefer a smaller model because the bigger the model is, the more it costs you to generate each token. So they're trying to figure out the perfect economics here, right? And if they could just do it with the smallest model ever, they would do it. So they're trying to find like the optimal balance for these kinds of things. And unfortunately, we don't know this because all of this is happening behind closed doors. And I think academia and others are like catching up on this where exactly this will fall.
Thank you. We have a question from an anonymous attendee who I'm going to guess is a Hill staffer asking, what role is there for legislation? Are there any concrete ideas in this space for how the US government could support its labs or slow down Chinese labs? And the way I'd like to answer this question is, again, putting the panelists on the spot. I'll put myself on the spot too, is if each of us could go around and just say one policy idea that you think could be helpful. That's something that could be taken up now either by the executive branch or by Congress. And It doesn't have to be, something that solves the problem or the biggest thing necessarily, but just one idea that you put forward that you think could help. Lennart, I'm guessing yours is going to have to do with export controls, but
Wow, yeah.
feel free to surprise
I'm
us.
gonna say the wild card. I mean, like export controls are a key tool we have available. It's a blunt tool. It doesn't solve all the problems, as I was saying, but I think it's helping us. It's building this foundation for everything we can build on top of this. Export controls can be done. That's within the authority of BIS. But I mean, many people have been talking about BIS being under-resourced, not having enough staffing, not having the tools. And I think this has been a discussion. People saw in the Remote Service Act, people saw it in the Force Act, discussing of staffing BIS more, potentially also giving them more authorities to also deal with remote compute controls. These are some ideas which people should study. The key thing to understand here for people, as we talk about AI chips, we talk about export controls. People always compare to weapons. In contrast to weapons, you can use these things remotely. So what is China doing? They're building a ton of data centers in Malaysia and then they dial in remotely. Export controls don't right now have clear authority for also restricting access to remotely accessing controlled items. You can do it via license conditions. The diffusion framework does a lot on this, but more clarity there, potentially, if people wanted to do so, would be useful. And the second thing which I'm going to be saying is we talked about securing data centers. We talked about securing AI companies. We need standards for this. At some point, standards need to be developed, which like clarify what do we need, and everybody's like we're all playing on the same level here. What are the things we're going to be asking from these companies, and they need to be forward-looking, right? Ideally, we have like state standards here. I would point to a report of colleagues of mine, which is about securing model weights, where they outline ideas for different security levels here, but this is not standard-ready language yet. So like anything which could happen on the hill to potentially thinking about how can we get a standard processing going might be like a valuable pursuit.
Thanks, Janet.
Well, you've covered BIS, which is great. You've covered security, which is great. So align with you on those. I think the remaining piece for me is a bit of a out of left field, but energy bottlenecks. It's an area where the administration has tried to take action, but ultimately comes back to Congress in terms of permitting approvals, multi-layers of jurisdictions going to hold up the development of energy that can then power compute to be used in America. And I think my concern is you've got other countries overseas, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, with massive access to readily available energy, capital, and particularly in the case of the Middle East, ability just to cut through regulations when they get in the way, given that they are more authoritarian in their regimes. And so I think for me, there is a risk that we start having leading amounts of compute leave the US when it can't get placed here, when it can't get powered here. And so in addition to sort of BIS being strengthened and standards for security of data centers and labs, I think that's another thing I'd add to the list.
Thanks. Cass?
Yeah, my addition to the list is actually a version of some advice that I have for a lot of problems in AI. I think that for any problem of the forum, man, I wish that the AI companies would do X better. One way to try to incentivize them to do X better involves forcing them to be at least minimally transparent about what they're doing related to X. Right. So my answer here is just, requiring documentation from the labs. In this case, the documentation would be about high level, non-compromising details about what their security policies are and what types of methods they implement in order to make things more secure. And there are already voluntary examples of reporting from labs like Anthropic about some of the security measures that they're taking. Again, this is high level, non-compromising stuff. But I want to underscore the importance of this by maybe trying to dispel what might be what one could consider to be like two myths about cybersecurity and AI companies and developers. One myth would be that the developers know all the solutions and it's just a matter of like, institutional will for them to implement all of them. And the other myth would be that developers even have the incentive to do that by themselves in the first place, right? Um, Understanding how both of these myths are kind of like not really true or basically false kind of comes from understanding just like how AI development works. AI is this rapidly moving technology, and the ecosystem rewards actors who move quickly and break things, and sometimes do things pretty recklessly. We see lots of examples, including from like DeepSeek recently itself, of AI companies doing things recklessly and sometimes getting themselves into trouble. So by requiring documentation about high-level non-compromising details about what labs are doing to improve their security, we both increase kind of our common collective understanding of what's possible and what people out there are doing. And we also create an incentive, like through the court of public opinion, for developers to responsibly invest in these kinds of things. So, yeah, I think this is one example of how like transparency can help us along the path to a better, a healthier ecosystem.
Great. So just to sum that all up, Lennart talked about uh, the export controls and the remote access issues. So I think the kind of items on the table regarding that are the AI diffusion rule that the Biden administration came out with in their last week or so in office that I think is uh, due to come into effect in the next few months, but will probably undergo some modifications by the Trump administration. There's also the Remote Access Security Act, which would put know your customer requirements for remote accessing cloud compute here in the US. That was introduced last Congress, will probably be reintroduced again. And then Janet spoke about the need for permitting reform to make it easier to build data centers and the energy to power them here in the US. There was the Manchin-Barrasso permitting reform bill that got pretty far last Congress. I expect there will be a new iteration of that in this Congress. And then Stephen Casper spoke about the need for transparency. And there's been some work on that in terms of voluntary commitments that the AI labs have made with the White House. There have been some congressional letters asking for information from the labs, and there's probably some conversations going on around legislation for transparency around certain issues with the labs. I'll make my own plug for a policy at ARI. We would love to see the US AI Safety Institute uh, uh, I guess, passed in enshrined in legislation. So there's been some legislation introduced to do that. I think the Future of AI Innovation Act last Congress. But I think we need to have people like Cass here who understand these issues and technical experts who can advise our government on it, who can help set standards for the industry at the US AI Safety Institute within Department of Commerce and NIST. So that's something I'd love to see strengthened. Okay, done with that question. We've got a few new questions in here. Oh wow, quite a lot. Let me just pick one. There's a follow-up from Ashley. We answered her question earlier, and she wanted clarification on can we develop new models with new and shiny capabilities that are the size of a distilled model without a larger base model having those capabilities first? Is there somewhere where DeepSeek could kind of happen without GPT first, or where DeepSeek could theoretically leapfrog us?
I can take that one in that, I mean, there's always a hypothetical world where there's a incredible algorithmic breakthrough or a new, neural networks breakthrough where people think, oh, wow, this is fundamentally changing the way we do AI. So I don't want to discount that. But I do think, and I think Sam Altman tweeted about this, it takes a lot of experimentation and pushing forward at the frontier to get to certain points. And then that makes it very easy to distill based on that base model. And so I don't think that's a particularly clear answer. It just depends, like the model of distillation, the distilled model tends to be usually less capable than the original model, but much more compute efficient. That's not saying that there won't be other breakthroughs that change the science and change our approach, but I think DeepSeek's success was also enabled by being able to be a fast follower.
Right. All right, we've got like 13 open questions and 10 minutes left. So I propose we do like a rapid fire round where I'll just kind of read out some of the questions and we just try to give like super short hot takes on answering them as best as they can. First one is, what types of assistance, like counterintelligence or cybersecurity, could or should the federal government provide to labs in securing the weights of these frontier models, and to what extent would the labs welcome such assistance? I threw out one proposal, which is to have the intelligence community do penetration testing collaboratively with the labs. I think also standards have been discussed as a tool to strengthen cybersecurity. Lennart, I saw you unmuted.
Counterintelligence is great. Personal vetting would also be great. Basically providing counterintelligence on employees. We talked about model distillation. I would bet the bigger deal is right now to which parties you currently go in San Francisco and how do you learn these secrets. And this also involves like the employees.
And I'd like to add on that in terms of when you are doing personnel vetting, I think there's a real opportunity to update the approach that Western countries typically take. We should be trying to do a reverse brain drain of other countries where we can, and bring them into the US so we can leverage the expertise. And then think mindfully about, do we need to bring family members across if they're from a state that is adversarial to the US so that there's no leverage of that person? So fast track opportunities for people to come to the US to bring their talent rather than chasing people away who may not fit the traditional personal vetting for national security clearance type.
Yeah, maybe we can lure the DeepSeek team over here. Um, Janet, you brought up the need to build data centers and systems that are secure by design. Is there like published guidance or sets of standards about how to do that?
We've got things like FedRAMP High. We've got things that are captured in the AI diffusion rule, which we're asking partner countries to implement. They're the current status quo, but more work's needed. Like FedRAMP High is a good start, but it's not designed for this purpose. And I think it's an area where further collaboration is needed between people who are the developers and working in data centers and governments who understand how these things can be exploited.
Um, Someone asked, is there any realistic path toward international consensus on AI IP protection? And what would cooperation on that look like? My guess is no, but anyone different take? Yeah.
Um, I might jump in to say I think that's where having a leadership from the US in the AI Safety Institute arena is really important because that's where these conversations will start to crop up. But I do want to bring the pessimistic attitude of like that will be useful for dealing with like-minded, rule-abiding countries, but there's a strong history of some nations just riding roughshod over IP protections and other technologies. And so we shouldn't expect that, for example, to curtail what some adversary nations might be doing.
Cass,
I would,
is
yeah, I'd be inclined to agree. And I would say our best bet is probably going to be some sort of like international consortium of AI governance offices from across the world, something like a UN office or some kind of IAEA office for AI. And we should expect that stuff that such an organization would do would be providing guidance that can be followed voluntarily by countries, rather than being able to strongly enforce something.
And Cass, quick question for you. Is it possible to insert prompt injections such that distillations would reveal the watermarks of who they used?
Yeah. So that's a pretty good, interesting question. So one good and bad thing about distillation, depending on what kind of technical objectives you're thinking about, is that you can only distill from a teacher to a student behaviors or representations related to the data that you use for distillation. Right? So a distilled model could have, sorry, a teacher model could have like a backdoor, or it could have a Trojan, or it could have, some sort of niche behavior or something, and then that could never appear in the student model, if the backdoor never appeared during training or something. When we talk about watermarks, what a watermark usually means for textual data is a particular identifiable style of the text, and that could have all sorts of forms, but like word choice biases is one example of like a textual like a way of watermarking text data. And this kind of thing can absolutely be passed down from teacher to student. So maybe the person asking this question is thinking, oh, could we catch, illicit distillers in the act by, giving the model that, we're going to serve online and be a potential teacher model by giving this model like uh, watermarking, by making it have watermark data. Um, and the answer is yes, this could definitely be useful as a kind of digital forensic strategy.
Um, All right, we've got a lot of other great questions here, but we're not going to be able to have time to get to them. Here's what I propose. ARI will make a list of all the questions. We'll share it with the panelists and attendees. Please follow all the panelists and ARI on Twitter, and we'll tweet out some of these questions and answers with our thoughts. Of course, it's all voluntary for the panelists, but I'll take a few and answer some of them. And I know the rest of my panelists are pretty active on Twitter as well, so that could be a fun way for us to keep the conversation going. Um, I would like to wrap up now. Got 5 minutes left with just short closing statements from each of the panelists with some of their kind of key takeaways from the conversation, what they like to convey to the audience. So maybe Lennart, can we start with you?
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks everybody for listening in. I hope the human distillation worked out. Maybe there's like some knowledge passed eventually down without breaking any terms of service here. Quite the opposite. This was the goal. Beyond that, I think, yeah, export controls are still a key tool, which will continue going forward. We got to protect the key chips and the resources. And we also got to think about promoting. I think that Janet brought up the data center, building more in the US, building more data centers. I think these are key topics right now in the policy domain. People should continue thinking, working on it. And yeah, thanks so much for all the questions. These are great questions. I'm always glad to see that people are on the ball and asking the right questions and trying to do their best to make sure this AI governance thing goes well.
Thank you. Janet?
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for hosting, Eric. It's been a really interesting conversation. I think a key takeaway for me is that the future of AI is still very uncertain. And but how it shapes out is increasingly determined by compute. So I think continuing to think about how to preserve US advantage in that ecosystem, but also how to share that advantage with other partners overseas, I think is really important. Recently, just been looking at digital Silk Road efforts in other nations. And if this is going to be the transformative infrastructure of the future, I think we want to make sure it's a democratic nation that's paving the way and laying down the railroads of what it's going to look like. So excited to keep engaging with folk in this space.
Thanks, Janet. Cass?
Yeah, really glad to be here. Thanks to everyone involved. And I think the closing thought that I would offer is like my answer to the question, so what does it all mean? So what? What do we make of this whole distillation thing? I think that, distillation and the potential for capability stealing that it offers is something that changes the dynamics of the game, but it doesn't really change the game itself. Right? Like Lennart and Janet said earlier, proliferation is a thing of AI, proliferation of AI capabilities is a thing. It always was going to be a thing. It's easy to be a fast follower. Any plans for like AI safety, security, or risk management that depend crucially on putting a lid on or bottling up some AI capabilities basically forever and not letting them proliferate kind of seems bankrupt and probably always was bankrupt. I think the thing that we need to take away from distillation, being a big part of the dynamics now, is that, we just need to be even more prepared for potentially more rapid proliferation than we might have expected. And, the AI proliferation thing is likely to be somewhat of a Pandora's box. And we need to think of it as maybe like a long-term institutional problem rather than a short-term technical solvable problem. And we just got to build the institutions that can help us adapt and be resilient to this kind of stuff.
Thank you all so much for being such wonderful panelists today. It's been a pleasure to host you guys and be able to share your learnings and views with this wider audience. And for the attendees, thank you so much for joining. And please do follow us, all of our panelists on Twitter, and we'll be continuing the Q&A there so that the conversation keeps going. And with that, thanks so much, everyone.